Ferrari at breakfast. Call 0345 6060 973.
7:49 is the time. Let's get the latest of the situation as we understand it in Kabul and indeed Kabul airport from Conservative MP and Armed Forces Minister James Heappey, who joins me now. What is the situation as you're hearing it at the airport, Minister? Good morning.
Morning, Nick. So the situation is that over the course of the week, the intelligence that we've been receiving over the imminence and credibility of an Islamic State attack has grown significantly to the point where, in all good conscience, we couldn't do anything but change the travel advice last night to advise people against moving to Kabul airport, and if they are at the airport, to move away to a place of safety. We don't do that lightly. It's not as if we can just pause the mission, deal with the threat, and then pick up where we left off. The clock continues to tick down to the end of the month. But I just don't know how government could know what we know and not seek to share that risk with people who would otherwise be making themselves a target. Noting
the severity of the intelligence that you've got, what can you tell us?
Just that it's a threat that emanates from the Islamic State affiliate, Islamic State in the Khorasan province. I don't think it would be appropriate to share the exact detail of the threat that we're that we're conscious of, but there is real imminence, there is real credibility, and there is real lethality to the plans that we're aware of.
Imminence as in days?
Hours, hence the urgency of changing the travel advice last night at the first opportunity.
So there could be an attack within hours of sorts on Kabul airport?
I was given lines today for what might happen if the attack happened whilst I was doing this media round. It is, we're not doing this unnecessarily. We're not being overly cautious. We're doing this because there is real credibility to the intelligence of something that is very imminent. And the horrendous thing is, Nick, is if you look on the TV, you'll still see crowds of desperate people still outside the airport. And that is hugely challenging because we're doing our best to convey a threat that those people are a target that we know that ISKP are seeking to hit, and it's hard.
Very hard. What are the orders for the British military? If there were to be mortar fire or gunfire as opposed to an attempted suicide attack, what are the British military instructed to do?
As the operational commander on the ground instructs them, that's their business and not something that ministers, even ex-military ones, would even dare to interfere with. They are well trained. They are our best troops in 16-hour assault, and they are used to being in these sorts of high-threat environments, in highly dynamic situations, and they will equip themselves well, I'm certain. And indeed, they have been doing operations over the night that I'm not at liberty to share the detail of, in order to try to put a bit more depth into our security around the EHC, so that they can have a bit more certainty about their immediate security. But there's a reality that, the troops that we've got in Kabul are holding the airport and that hotel. There's no depth to that beyond the sort of 100, 200 meters around the places that they're in. Thereafter, it is the Taliban providing the wider security. So our ability to get out there and interdict the threat is minimal, and our ability to kind of hold the threat at bay is similarly limited. That's the reality of the mission that we're embarked on.
How many Britons or how many dual nationals do you think might be left behind?
Well, that's a very hard number to nail down.
The Guardian's reporting there are around 50 dual nationals, British and Afghan with dual nationality, outside Kabul airport as of yesterday.
So there may well be that number in the immediate vicinity of Kabul airport. That's not a number that I've had briefed to me. We think there's around 400 eligible people still within Afghanistan. That number could be far lower. That is, I think, a worst case. The Foreign Office tend to kind of assume people are there until they know otherwise. But there are people that we've been struggling to get hold of for weeks who, when we finally get hold of them, it turns out that they are in Dubai or another place. So that is the uncertainty, the fog, if you like, of the of the situation in which our troops are operating. Clearly, there are people that have stayed in the queue. We're doing our best to get them into a place of safety, but we're also stressing to people that we really don't advise that it's safe to join the queue given the threat as it is at the moment. We will make contact with everybody who is moving away from the airport to talk to them about what might be an alternative route to the UK, either through the air bridge for as long as it exists or another way. But you'll forgive me perhaps if I don't necessarily advertise what those alternatives might be, simply because they then themselves become a target.
Of course. There's been a lot of coverage of one particular British national, former Marine Paul or Pen Farthing, with his animal sanctuary. There is a suggestion that the time and effort that's had to be poured to that has been an unfortunate diversion. Would you call it that, Minister?
I think that he is a British national who has become very high profile, and he has a number of people that work for him who, as a consequence of the profile of his charity, are considered to be at risk. The government's responded to that by bringing them into the Leave Outside the Rules scheme so that they can come to the UK. Clearly, the logistics of moving a large number of animals in the midst of moving thousands upon thousands of people is very challenging. But this country is a nation of animal lovers, and the desire within the Ministry of Defence is to help to facilitate that, notwithstanding that our priority must be the people that we're trying to evacuate. But if Mr. Farthing is able to tell us the registration of the plane that he has chartered, we will be able to feed that into the combined air operations cell that is run by the United States and Al Udeid in Qatar to facilitate a landing slot. The bit that's more challenging is, I know that his request this morning is that he and his staff be given safe passage through the crowds and into the airport. That I think is more challenging, because that is, safe passage, I think, is another way of saying to be brought to the front of the queue. And those are, I think, if you're in the queue and you're not in his group, you might regard that as being unfair. These are the sorts of tensions that we have to live with, and I've tried to make a policy over the last week of being brutally honest so that people can see exactly the complexities of the choices we're making. Is he attempting to bring his animals with him as well as his staff and colleagues? It's my understanding that his animals are indeed in the queue outside Kabul airport at the moment. The Foreign Office travel advice having changed, he has moved overnight and is now in that crowd with his staff and animals. Politico is reporting this morning an extraordinary briefing from the United Nations to their Afghan staff, telling them your calm and positive interaction with armed elements or de facto authorities should remain clear, honest and confident. What value the United Nations and what the United Kingdom, the US and others are trying to do at the airport? Well, I don't know that the UN is fundamental to any of our national plans. NEO's non-combatant evacuation operations are very much sovereign endeavours. Each country has their plan. Op pitting is long-standing. I'm very nervous, though, to hear people speaking ill of the UN generally, because I think that we should all be clear that once the international community has left at the end of this airlift, the United Nations and its agencies are clear that they will remain and that they will continue to seek to facilitate the passage of refugees. They will continue to seek to facilitate the distribution of international aid. That's the value of the United Nations, not necessarily them having a direct or active role in the execution of sovereign plans for evacuating non-combatants in a situation like this. And lastly, you mentioned earlier that you were briefed, or you had been briefed during our conversations, there had been a terror attack on the airport. What were you instructed to say? Well, as you can imagine, Nick, it was that we would have to be reacting to a lot of uncertainty. It wouldn't be clear about the details straight away, and so people were sort of wanting me to get my head around the fact that I wouldn't be able to answer questions in the sort of detail that I would like live on air. And I don't think anybody needed to tell me. I would have been very keen and quick to want to condemn what's been going on. I mean, I just the opportunism that, I mean, I don't think anybody should be surprised by this. Daesh or Islamic State are guilty of all sorts of evil, whether that be in Syria or the Lake Chad Basin or the Sahel or northern Mozambique or in Afghanistan. But the opportunism of wanting to target a major international humanitarian mission is just utterly deplorable, but sadly true to form for an organisation as barbarous as Daesh.
But lastly, how is a para at Kabul airport meant to tell whether the citizen marching towards him or her with a backpack is an Afghan genuinely fleeing in terror, or is an ISIS or ISK suicide bomber? How does he or she make that decision?
And that's why, if you are a military person, the suicide bomber is the most insidious threat of all, because the whole purpose of that as a method of attack is designed to create a wedge between the international forces that are seeking to provide security and the population at large, because of their suspicions that one of them might be a suicide bomber. Now, our people are given incredible training for trying to identify various sort of telltales for how people might look as they are in the process of mounting a suicide bombing, but they are extraordinarily hard to stop. And I've patrolled in very high threat environments where there's been a very credible threat of suicide bombers, where the crowds have been nowhere near as thick as this, and it's terrifying to be able to know that that threat exists when the crowds are as thick as they are. It verges on impossible, and I can only pay tribute to the brave men and women who have stood there outside the Baron Hotel facing that threat right now.
Well, that's my last comment to you. The bravery of these men and women, some of whom are pretty young, the bravery is extraordinary, James.
Well, I mean, I agree. I mean, imagine that you are there, you've been faced with that desperation, that suffering, you've seen people die in the crush of the queue outside you, you have spent the whole week trying to save life, facilitate safe passage, protect the vulnerable. And you have to do all of that whilst knowing that potentially within the crowd is some body who is trying to take lives in their hundreds, who, and I just, these are 18 and 19-year-old brave young men and women who have signed up to serve in our nation's armed forces. They're heroes, Nick, and we should all be really proud of them. They have brought out 12,279 people up to 6 a.m. this morning, and they've done that in 11 days from a standing start. We won't get everybody out. There will be people on your TV screens over the weekend that have been left behind. But absolutely none of the paras, the pilots, anybody who has been involved in this mission should look at those TV pictures and see it as a personal reflection of their endeavours over the last few days. The reality is that we've brought out 5,000 people, already more than we thought we needed to bring out when we started this mission. It's the most remarkable effort. They're doing it in the face of the most severe of threats. It's just such a shame that we can't bring everybody out. It's such a shame that this threat is disrupting our evacuation effort over the period that the threat remains as acute as it is. I wish it weren't that way, but it is.
Incredible bravery, as you say. I'm grateful for your time as ever. Conservative MP, Armed Forces Minister James Heappey appearing here on LBC, where it's 3 minutes after 8 news is next.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, UK nationals in Afghanistan have been told not to travel to Kabul airport